They said the old metal box wasn't worth opening, just a dusty relic buried behind the equipment lockers, until the day a trembling private cracked it open and found a radio handset wrapped in cloth like a relic, a call sign etched along the side that made him whisper, "No way, this belonged to her." And as the story spread across the base like a quiet storm, every mechanic, every sergeant, every officer who had ever dismissed the small woman with grease-stained hands felt the same sinking realization. They had no idea who Elena Marquez truly was. Before we begin, drop in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe respect should be earned by what someone does, not what someone looks like, go ahead and like and subscribe, because this story, this one proves it. It started on a Tuesday, one of those gray afternoons where the clouds sit low and heavy, the kind of day that makes people impatient and irritable, snapping over things that don't matter. The motor pool smelled of old oil, burnt coffee, and the stale tension of a dozen young men convinced they knew more than they did. And right in the center of it all, kneeling in the narrow space beneath the comms rack that half the staff refused to touch, was Elena, 28 years old, hair tied back with an improvised zip tie, because she'd misplaced her clips, sleeves rolled up past her elbows, hands steady despite the storm brewing around her. Most people didn't look at her twice. They walked past her like she was part of the furniture, another contractor blending into the piles of wires and metal. The soldiers joked that she was just here to fix the toys, a line that got passed around with smirks, especially from Sergeant Dalton, a man whose voice was always just a bit too loud in confidence, just a bit too unearned. Earlier that day, he'd leaned over her shoulder, breath thick with energy drink and ego, tapping the side of the damaged encrypted radio and saying, "Careful with that, Marquez. This is the real stuff. Not one of your hobby kits." Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply reached deeper into the wiring harness, flipping a corroded module with the ease of someone who had done this in worse conditions, with less light, under far more dangerous circumstances. But no one in that room knew that. No one knew that the way she handled equipment wasn't learned in trade school, not in any place with air conditioning or laminated safety charts. No, the precision in her fingertips came from nights spent in places where a single missed connection meant a team wouldn't make it home. But that was another life, a life she had shut quietly behind her at 25, leaving only shadows where metals once hung. The base didn't know that history. They didn't know her. They only saw a quiet woman in stained coveralls, always early, always focused, always alone. As she reassembled the radio, the storm outside cracked open with a rumble that traveled through the bay, shaking a few of the looser tools on the shelves. A couple of privates flinched theatrically, earning laughter as they passed around a bag of chips, eyes drifting toward Elena in that way people do when they're looking for something to mock. "She probably thinks that sound is interference," one whispered. "I bet she's never even heard a real field breach," another said, and yet his voice carried a note of uncertainty he tried to swallow. Elena pretended not to hear. She always pretended not to hear. But she wasn't deaf to disrespect. She was disciplined by experience, trained to conserve her voice for things that mattered. That's what unnerved some people, her calm, the centered silence she carried like a shield. It was the kind of quiet that made people uneasy because they couldn't decide if she was shy or something else. And then something happened, something so small that no one realized it was the beginning of everything that followed. Elena reached for the final connector, the one that controlled the secure channel. Routing, something only someone highly trained would even recognize. She clicked it into place with a soft snap, rotated the frequency dial, and wiped her fingers on her pant leg. The radio hummed to life. She tested the primary line first, static. She adjusted the gain. Clean. Then she pressed the side button, preparing to run diagnostics on the encrypted channel no one had successfully activated in months. "Hey, Marquez," Dalton called from across the room. "Don't break it now." The mechanic snickered. Elena didn't react. She simply exhaled softly and switched to the secure line. The room didn't quiet. Conversations continued. Chairs scraped. Jokes flew. No one cared what she was doing. No one thought it mattered. No one imagined she was about to open a frequency that hadn't been touched since before most of them graduated high school. No one imagined the voice that was waiting there. The speaker crackled, once, then again. Elena froze. Not in fear. In recognition. A tone cut through the static. sharp and unmistakable, like a fingerprint burned into memory. Conversations in the bay continued for another second, too, until a voice rolled out from the handheld speaker, a voice so controlled and commanding it made the air feel heavier. "Cobra, forward recon ready." The words echoed through the motor pool. Tools stopped clattering. Jokes died mid-breath. Heads turned. Dalton's grin collapsed. And Elena Marquez, still kneeling beside the rack, still holding the receiver loosely in her hand, closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Because the voice on the other end wasn't calling for the base. It wasn't calling for the mechanics. It wasn't calling for Sergeant Dalton. It was calling her. And every person in that room felt the shift, like the world had just tilted, like the quiet little radio tech they'd ignored for months had suddenly stepped out of a shadow they never knew was there. They didn't understand the call sign. They didn't understand why a general, because anyone with ears knew that was a general, would break through a dead frequency for a single operative codename. All they knew was that nothing about Elena Marquez was what they thought. And this was only the beginning. For a moment, the motor pool held its breath, every sound fading into a thick, electric silence as the words echoed again from the speaker. "Cobra, forward recon ready." And the mechanics, who minutes earlier had been laughing over chips, now stared at Elena as if she had transformed in front of them. Dalton took an involuntary step back, his throat bobbing with a swallow he tried to hide. Even he knew a call like that didn't just drift onto open airwaves, and definitely not through a system no one had been able to repair for months. Elena didn't speak, didn't lift her head, didn't even blink. She simply pressed the side button with a steadiness none of them had ever noticed in her before, and her voice, usually soft and almost forgettable, came out low, clipped, and razor-sharp with familiarity. "This is Cobra, 3, send traffic." The entire room shifted, like something invisible had snapped into focus, and the privates who had once called her Radio Girl now stood frozen, unsure whether to run, salute, or just keep breathing. The speaker hissed, then the voice returned, older now than she remembered, but carrying the same unshakable authority she had once built her world around. "Marquez, good to hear your voice. We didn't expect you to re-establish comms." The way he said her name, Marquez, not civilian technician, not miss, not contract worker, but Marquez, with the weight of history behind it, made the younger soldiers glance at each other in a mix of confusion and dawning fear. Dalton finally found his voice, cracking as he barked. What is this? Who the hell are you talking to? What does Cobra even mean?" But Elena didn't answer him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the radio, the way a person looks at an old wound they never thought would reopen. Only a few in the room recognized the faint tremor in her hand, not fear, but memory, the kind that sat deep in the bones, carved there by nights without sleep and missions carried out in the shadows. A private, barely 20, whispered, "Forward recon, wasn't that the unit that went dark years ago?" Another muttered, "I thought they were blacked out, like erased from record." Outside, the storm rumbled again, as if the sky itself was reacting to the frequency now alive in the bay. Then tires screeched on wet pavement. Doors slammed outside. More than one, too many for a casual visit. Dalton spun toward the entrance just as 3 military SUVs rolled to a stop, their engines idling like restless animals. Officers climbed out, dress uniforms drenched in rain, faces grim, movements sharp with urgency rather than ceremony. They didn't look around. They didn't ask where to go. They headed straight for the motor pool. The soldiers inside instinctively formed a loose line, confused but obedient, and the whispers grew frantic. "Who are they here for? Is something happening? Are we in trouble?" But the officers walked past every one of them, past the sergeant, past the senior mechanic, past the civilians. They stopped in front of Elena. Elena, who still sat on her knees beside the open rack like she didn't know she had just cracked open a piece of classified history. And then, impossibly, the man who led them, a tall figure with a silver star pin glinting on his rain-soaked uniform, stepped forward. His boots splashed against the concrete. His presence quieted the entire bay. And with a voice that carried the same gravity as the one on the radio, he spoke a single line that made every soldier in the room pale. "Cobra, 3, on your feet." Dalton's jaw dropped. The privates gasped. Because only one person in the entire U.S. forward recon program had earned that designation under the age of 25, and according to rumors and classified scraps, they'd died overseas. But Elena rose slowly, calmly, as if waking from a long sleep, and the general nodded, eyes steady with something halfway between respect and regret. "We thought we lost you," he said quietly. "And these people, they deserve to know who's standing in front of them." Behind him, the officers formed a line, not blocking Elena in, but standing at her back like she was one of their own, like she had never left. The motor pool was silent now, air thick enough to choke on. Every pair of eyes locked on the woman they had overlooked for months. No one laughed. No one smirked. No one dared breathe too loudly. Because suddenly, every rumor, every shadowed page, every whispered myth about forward recon had a face standing right there in the grease-stained coveralls of a woman they thought was nobody. And for the first time since she'd walked onto the base as a quiet technician, Elena Marquez didn't look like someone trying to blend in. She looked like someone who knew exactly who she was, and someone the entire room had been catastrophically wrong about. The motor pool felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness what came next, and Elena stood in the center of it all with rainwater dripping from the general's shoulders onto the concrete floor, his presence casting a gravity that pulled every wandering eye toward her. No one spoke. Even Dalton, loud, confident Dalton, stood stiff as a child caught doing something unforgivable. The general's gaze swept the room once, cold and precise, before returning to Elena with a gentleness that didn't match the medals across his chest. "Marquez," he said, voice low but carrying through the still air. "There was a time when Cobra forward recon didn't move unless you cleared the path. Your intel saved 43 soldiers in a valley we weren't supposed to survive. Your hands restored comms under fire when everyone else had gone down. And when extraction went sideways, you stayed behind so the rest could get out." A few privates shifted, eyes widening, the scope of what he was saying sinking in like a slow shock. Elena lowered her eyes, not out of shame, but because she had never worn her past like a badge. "I didn't stay behind for medals," she murmured, almost too softly to hear. "I stayed because someone had to." The general nodded, a faint ache flickering across his stern expression. "And we carried that debt, all of us. You disappeared after the fallout. Papers mark you deceased. We honored the loss. But you didn't want honoring, did you? You wanted quiet." Elena exhaled, the truth exposed but strangely freeing. "Quiet is easier," she whispered. "Quiet keeps people safe." The officers behind the general stepped forward then, forming a sharp, deliberate line at her flank. Not to escort her away, but to stand with her, shoulder to shoulder, reclaiming her like a missing piece of a family long scattered. The younger soldiers watched with a mix of awe and shame, and Dalton, his face pale and rigid, finally stepped forward, voice cracking as he forced out the words, "Ma'am, I said things I shouldn't have. I didn't know who you were." Elena looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, Dalton seemed to shrink under the weight of her steady, unflinching silence. "Respect isn't about knowing," she said gently. "It's about choosing." The general's eyes softened. "She's right. And from this day forward, every person who walks through these doors will know exactly who Elena Marquez is." He reached into the inner pocket of his soaked jacket and withdrew a small cloth-wrapped patch, black background, silver serpent curling around a stealth emblem, the insignia of Forward Recon Unit 7. The room inhaled sharply as he held it out. Elena didn't hesitate. She accepted it with a quiet nod, her fingers brushing the stitched edges of the life she once lived. "Come back with us," the general offered, not as an order, but as an invitation weighted with history. Elena smiled, small but certain, and shook her head. "No, I'm right where I'm needed." The general didn't argue. Some people, he understood, carry service with them long after they've stepped out of uniform. He turned sharply, signaling the officers, and the line broke with crisp precision as they filed toward the exit, leaving behind an air so charged it felt like static. When the heavy doors closed and the convoy's engines rumbled back to life outside, the soldiers slowly turned toward her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something deeper. Reverence. Oh, and a humility that tasted like truth finally learned. From that day on, no one in the motor pool ever called her Radio Girl again. New recruits were told the story in hushed tones. The day a general addressed a quiet technician as Cobra, free. The day an entire base discovered they had been walking past a legend in grease-stained coveralls. And sometimes, when Elena stayed late in the bay, adjusting dials or soldering new connections with the same steady hands that once held the fate of a forward team, she'd catch someone watching her with a look not of pity or confusion, but of respect earned the hardest way possible. But Elena never looked back at them with pride. She only listened to the soft hum of the radio, the frequency alive again, the past finally at peace with the present. And every once in a while, when the storm clouds were low and the static quieted just right, she'd hear the faint echo of a call sign, Cobra, and know that somewhere out there, her old unit still carried her name with them, not as a myth or a mystery, but as a reminder. The strongest warriors aren't always the ones who stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, they kneel in the shadows, fixing what holds the whole world together.